I don't usually like using the terms overrated or underrated. It's one thing to disagree with popular opinion on something, but another thing entirely to believe everyone else rated it wrong. With that in mind, I felt the critical reaction to AC Syndicate was, at launch, very fair. The consensus seemed to be that it was an okay game that did what it could to repair some of the damage Unity had done to the franchise, but that ultimately wasn't what the series needed at the time. Syndicate is the game I have played least, and that I perhaps have the fewest memories of. A victim of its own banality and the series fatigue that had reached a peak by 2015, it was an easy game to pick up and forget about. But after making this channel, I was genuinely surprised to see so many commenters marking Syndicate as their least favorite game in the franchise. To an extent, I can understand that. The series has become very divisive, and it's hard to see where this game can actually fit into those heated discussions. If you're a big Ezio fan, Syndicate probably isn't your favorite. If your favorite game is Unity, then you probably see Syndicate as a step back, and if your favorite games are the latest titles, then Syndicate probably lacks a lot of what you like about the series. And yet at the same time, I struggle to identify with the opinion that Syndicate represents the series at its lowest. Now, it's not like this game is universally hated and needs me to defend it. Type in AC Syndicate Underrated into your search bar, and you'll see plenty of videos sharing my sentiment. But that said, while I have my problems with the game, I think it deserves recognition beyond just not being the worst AC game. In fact, I think many aspects of Syndicate represent the series at its absolute peak. Syndicate sports the most dynamic city in the series, some of the most impressive stealth in the series, the coolest assassinations in the series, some of the most fleshed out side content in the series, all resulting in one of the most complete games in the series. And so despite a lack of ambition and some iffy design choices, Syndicate stands on its own by being something that many Assassin's Creed titles forget to be: a fun video game. Syndicate, arguably more than any other game in this series, can't be discussed without understanding the context of the game that came before it. The legacy of Assassin's Creed Unity is complex, defined in equal parts by innovative ideas and greedy corporate sloppiness. The launch of the game remains one of Ubisoft's greatest disasters, with widespread glitches only acting as a surface-level scapegoat to cover inconsistent mechanics, a painful lack of interesting content, terrible writing, and a slew of other problems. But at the same time, we were treated to new levels of mechanical depth, amazing mocap performances, and one of the most visually stunning open worlds of all time. Unity's ambition and desire to innovate was overshadowed only by its stark failure to actually make its great ideas functional. And so now we bring Ubisoft Quebec into the picture. Syndicate would have been in development for only a year or so at this point, and the franchise just hit an all-time low in terms of fan trust. Assassin's Creed was the butt of the joke on every gaming website on the internet, and Quebec was tasked with taking a framework that was getting dragged through the mud and building something that actually worked with only 11 months and change until launch. This series is no stranger to damage control, but never had the order been as tall as this. With over-ambition and technical issues being at the forefront of Unity's criticism, Syndicate's only realistic option in many places was to scale back and improve stability at the cost of less impressive visuals and mechanics. This is where the divide comes in. A lot of people praise Unity for its desire to be ambitious, and if you are someone who believes the innovations of Unity cancel out its flaws, I'm not trying to change your mind here. But personally, I don't think Unity ever had the time, budget, or technical capability to make the game that they wanted to make. Syndicate benefits from not aiming quite so high. Yes, immediately it is clear that the graphics are a step down, and the mocap pales in comparison to what we saw with Arno and his supporting cast, and yet Syndicate's cutscenes are much more polished than Unity's. Texture pop-in and issues with physics-based assets like hair and clothes are still present, but much less common than in the last game, and it reduces the heavily overdone blur effect that plagued Unity. The action scenes were also a nauseating collection of quick cuts that never looked good, and by contrast, Syndicate is able to handle movement and action incredibly well, easily presenting a train derailment straight into gameplay, while Unity would sometimes struggle with characters just standing still and talking. My concerns about graphical stability were calmed in the intro cutscene, where the main villain, Crawford Starrick, punches a table and all the items on it shift around. Unity would have visually imploded if it tried to do that. Cutscenes are one thing, but when you're actually playing the game, it immediately feels so much smoother than its older sibling. And I want to be fair to Unity, because my recent playthroughs have been on PC and PS5, where the experience is much better than it once was. But taking ourselves back to 2015, Syndicate is vastly better optimized for the hardware it was actually built on, even if we're talking about post-patch Unity. You can look at Digital Foundry's video where they quickly go over the significant frame rate and stability improvements the game was able to make at the time. Character models and buildings may not have the same level of detail, but everything runs at a consistent frame rate and pop-in is drastically reduced. The biggest pop-in offender in Unity was the huge crowds of thousands of NPCs, which Syndicate controversially cut back on. The streets are much sparser in London than they were in Paris, and I can't pretend that doesn't take away from the experience. Unity's crowds were a marvel in their own way, and unlike anything I can say I've ever seen since. However, a huge part of that is that Unity really didn't figure out the tech either. NPCs pop in and out of existence by the dozen on a second-to-second basis, even on powerful hardware. As cool as they are in concept, I have never once seen a crowd in this game that was graphically stable. It says something that Unity, a nearly 10-year-old game, was attempting crowd density that I don't think I've seen done successfully as of 2023. There comes a point where ambition translates to delusion over what your tech can handle. And so Syndicate has smaller crowds, but they are populated by human beings instead of T-1000-esque shapeshifters. Syndicate still has large crowds when it wants to, but it uses them sparingly and keeps them tame enough that you can utilize them for ambiance and social stealth in a way that remains technically sound throughout. Now I want to be very clear, Syndicate runs like a dream compared to Unity, but it still has plenty of issues compared to other open-world games. There are a lot of wide-open areas in London with very few buildings to hide things loading in, and so texture pop-in happens all the time as you traverse the world, especially by carriage when you're moving fast. And while glitches are a penny to a dollar compared to even post-patch Unity going by my playthroughs, the game isn't exactly polished to a mirror sheen. Detection issues happen from time to time, and remember that face glitch that got so infamous in Unity? I've never met anyone who actually saw it in that game, but lo and behold, one day I booted up the menu for Syndicate and there was Lydia Fry, just chilling there without a face. But Syndicate's glitches are momentary inconveniences, while Unity's technical issues were constant and unavoidably baked into the systems themselves. I understand why not everyone would agree, but to me, the toned-back graphical quality and NPC density were worthwhile trade-offs for the stability that Syndicate achieves. Speaking more on this phenomenon, Syndicate's iteration of Victorian London also feels less impressive than Unity's Paris on eye test alone. The lighting is one of the most eye-catching aspects of AC Unity, and to this day it doesn't have a lot of competition when it comes to its sheer beauty. This is achieved in part through the use of baked-in lighting. Unity has no day-night cycle, instead shifting between times of day based on your own movement through different regions. This means objects in the environment do not have to react to a moving light source, allowing the developers more agency in crafting the world. London doesn't have this, and at a purely visual level, it doesn't look as good as Unity's Paris. But it makes up for it by being much, much more dynamic in basically every way. Not only does a full day and night cycle return, but so too does a more complex weather system with rain and fog rolling in at random to give the city a different feel as you traverse it. Unity may have had huge crowds, but there is just so much more happening on your screen at any given time in Syndicate, whether it be a series of fire engines passing you on the road, a troupe of musicians playing for a crowd, or the evening train sounding off in the distance. Unity was also praised for its multitude of explorable interiors, and Syndicate lacks these as well. There are still plenty, but they are significantly toned down, likely another sacrifice in the name of stability. That being said, the diversity of the interiors we do get is fantastic. In fact, the visual diversity of the city in general is top shelf. Syndicate is by far the most chronologically recent entry in the series, so while London lifts its fair share of assets from Paris, the skyline is totally unique. Factory smokestacks blacken the sky, train stations feel like these giant glass monuments, and steam engines endlessly flow across the Thames. One of my biggest criticisms of Unity was how it failed to fill its gorgeous world with things to do that enhanced its setting. Syndicate does not fall into that trap, instead having one of the most lively and content-rich worlds in the series, right up there next to AC4's Caribbean. Where Unity's content was sometimes quirky and fun, but still tended to boil down to sprinting between markers, Syndicate is much more creative. While there are still collectibles and bloat, they are a far cry from the barrage of chests and icons that littered the map of Paris. Everything feels like it has a purpose, and this is in part due to the borough conquering system that the game employs. While Unity's map was an assortment of random missions, Most of Syndicate side content ties into conquering London, piece by piece with your gang, the Rooks. Choosing to focus on gang warfare as per the title of the game was an interesting choice for a game set in Victorian London, maybe cashing in on the popularity of Peaky Blinders at the time. Mechanically, however, the Rooks end up functioning similar to the assassin recruit feature that started in Brotherhood. You have agents all over the city that you can bring into battle with you or use as distraction opportunities as you dismantle the Templars' hold of the city's criminal element. As you move through the city, you can start a gang war, engage in carriage chases, liberate child laborers from Templar factories, win money in underground fight clubs, kidnap Templars to hand them over to the police, intervene in smuggling operations on a moving train, and engage in a variety of narrative quests for historical figures like Charles Dickens and Charles Darwin that add flavor to the world. While side missions in Unity involved Arno walking up to a quest giver and silently standing there while an audio file played, Syndicate is full of narrative content that showcases the twins' personalities outside of the main story. Even listing all this stuff, it doesn't do justice to just how much more content this game has compared with Unity. The fact that this is the only game in the series with a fully fledged vehicle system, and that they were able to implement that after a game where the NPCs could barely walk straight half the time, is a pretty incredible accomplishment. And on top of all that, we have the icing on the cake, the World War I side arc. In Unity, the Rift missions where the player would briefly get glimpses of other time periods like the German occupation of World War II were awesome, but Syndicate's version is an immense leap forward. If you stumble upon the right marker at the edge of the River Thames, you will be transported to World War I era London, where you will get to complete a fully fleshed out sequence as Lydia Fry, the granddaughter of Jacob. It has its own revamped chunk of the map, its own narrative, and even some unique mechanics that you don't see outside of this flash forward. This is, in my opinion, one of the greatest surprises in all of gaming. Finding this segment of the game without knowing it existed beforehand is such a treat, especially in a game that is already full of cool content. This game doesn't sport my favorite setting in the series, but London is by far my favorite individual city in Assassin's Creed. A lot of aspects of Syndicate have ups and downs when compared to Unity, but in terms of creating a living, dynamic, content-rich city to explore, I think Syndicate absolutely blows Unity out of the water. However, we can't talk about this city without addressing how it handles parkour, and that is where London starts to stumble a bit. While Syndicate carries over plenty of assets from Unity in terms of world design, it immediately feels different to traverse, and not necessarily for the better. Of all Unity's mechanics, the parkour is by far the most polarizing, with some people marking it as the most revolutionary traversal system of all time, and others labeling it as a janky, broken mess. Now, obviously, based on my tone and the 95-minute video I made about Unity, I fall into the latter category. But if you watch that video, you know I didn't brush it off entirely. I am here to talk about Syndicate, and if you want my full opinion on Unity, you can watch that video, but the gist is that while the parkour is an absolute marvel when it works, the unfortunate truth is that it just doesn't work a lot of the time. It is perhaps the most mechanically innovative system of its kind, with the combination of parkour up and down and the huge variety of animations giving the player the most performable actions of any AC game to date. However, the removal of precision inputs like consistent cancels and ejects took control away from the player. The terrible animation blending and stretching of existing animations makes the parkour look floaty and choppy, and the over-reliance on automation isn't advanced enough for the complexity of the city, making Arno feel like he has a mind of his own. As a result, like with many other components I have discussed, Syndicate's response was to cut back. It has a much more limited parkour system when compared with Unity, and the first place you'll see that is in the structure of the city itself. There are far fewer catered parkour pathways than in Paris, with London lacking the complex obstacle courses of signage and wooden posts that Unity had in abundance. The commonly criticized wider streets meant that parkour flow was regularly interrupted, reduced interiors meant going in and out of open windows for parkour was rarer, and Jacob and Evie are much more prone to stopping in their tracks given that you cannot manually force them to make any jump the game doesn't register they can make, removing a lot of depth from the traversal. So far this all seems like negatives, but the system legitimately does smooth out a lot from its predecessor. Going inside windows was a chore in Unity and it is more consistent in Syndicate, and while jumping along the parkour pathways on the sides of buildings was a mess in the last game due to Arno's insistence on sticking to the walls, Jacob and Evie actually prioritize following the straight path. It is a legitimately more polished system, but a lot of that is by virtue of removing control options and the game giving itself fewer opportunities to fail. If that is where Syndicate stopped, it would have been an abject failure. A little bit of polish wasn't worth gutting Unity's comprehensive system, and the removal of manual jump alone was enough to make it feel actively worse than Unity even with less jank. But that is where the game's most controversial gameplay addition is introduced, the grappling hook. In a game all about climbing, Ubisoft gave us a tool that could skip the climbing, and with the press of a button you can scale buildings and cross city blocks with ease. While general movement can still feel unpolished in Syndicate, the grappling hook is amazingly precise and easy to use. While putting a beam and a pole in front of Arno will leave him absolutely flabbergasted as to which one you want him to jump to, somehow Evie and Jacob are able to shoot a rope across a 50-meter gap exactly where you want it to go with solid consistency. It doesn't match up to the grapnel launcher from the Arkham games, but it holds its own, and personally, I find it really fun to zip over the wide streets of London. It creates a system where you can never really get stuck or find yourself with nowhere to go. But I want to make it clear that I understand why it isn't for everyone. It is yet another example of Ubisoft putting a band-aid over a broken mechanic instead of actually trying to fix it. However, there are a lot of voices that see Unity's ambition and condemn Syndicate for not, quote-unquote, just fixing its systems, and I take issue with that. Next year, Unity will be a decade old. In the time since, no game within or without this franchise has ever come close to polishing Unity's ideas. I may not be a developer, but I know I can't judge how easy something should be if literally no one has done it. It is easy to say they should have used their limited time to fix automation to make it 100% reliable, solve animation blending so the hundreds of potential parkour interactions looked perfect, remove input lag and visual glitches, make 3,000 plus NPC crowds possible on last-gen hardware, and so on and so forth. But Ubisoft Montreal didn't figure out how to do that. No company since has figured out how to do that, and like it or not, Quebec decided they didn't know either. The team realized they didn't have the time to totally restructure the world and the parkour, so they created a new traversal system from the ground up on top of it, with the purpose of essentially bypassing the flaws of Unity. Sure, we would still have parkour up and down and some cool traversal options, but everything was made simple to cover the gaps in the system. It sucks to lose parkour options, and if you hate Syndicate for that, I can't blame you. Even though I don't think Quebec had a lot of options, it's still Ubisoft's fault for deciding a game needed to come out 1 year after Unity crashed and burnt, partially due to a lack of time. But while Syndicate makes a good scapegoat, it wasn't this game that ruined our chances of a refined version of Unity's systems. Unity managed to do that itself. And you know what? I think the grappling hook is really fun to use on its own, and while Unity may look better in heavily choreographed videos, Syndicate actually works on a moment-to-moment basis with the controller in your hand. I think it is somewhat of a miracle that when backed into a corner with no real way to do what the fans wanted, Quebec still came out the other side with a creative, fun, and functional traversal mechanic. Stealth is a little different from the other aspects of this game in that instead of being a desperate cover-up of a broken mechanic, it's actually just straight up better than in Unity. It isn't broken, the level design is interesting, and you have a solid suite of player tools and abilities. For context, this was only the second game in the series featuring the revamped stealth system introduced in Unity, and having finally achieved crouch capability, Assassin's Creed had a newfound focus on waist-high cover and tight hallways. In my Unity video, I stated that parkour and combat felt broken beyond repair, but stealth was a hair away from greatness. Unfortunately, a poor detection system, idiotic AI, inconsistent tools, and a cumbersome cover system combined for a subpar showing. Every single one of these criticisms is resolved in Syndicate. The AI is by no means groundbreaking, but you can't just crouch behind a corner and kill a dozen fully aware guards anymore. When a person detects you, guards in a logical radius around them will get aggroed on you, as opposed to anyone on a Parisian city block. You have the ability to whistle, something that was strangely absent from Unity, and you have different animations for crouched versus standing assassinations. There is no more sticky cover, you just press your character against a wall and they will automatically go into cover, no hassle. But more important than all that is the fact that it is legitimately fun. The vertical level design of London allows for multi-floor sneaking encounters with a good spread of enemies to get around that feel challenging but fair. We see a very respectable tool set with smoke bombs, throwing knives, berserk darts, voltaic bombs, and pistols at your disposal. These are all standard Assassin's Creed fare, and unlike in Unity, they will all generally work as advertised. One criticism that I do have is the fact that you can only equip one tool at a time, and that combined with the lack of consistent lethal quickshot options means that the player doesn't have as many opportunities for the fast-paced, aggressive stealth that got popular in Unity. That may not be your playstyle, but reduced options are still worth noting. However, one thing I really don't like regardless of playstyle is the fact that you can only put the hood on while crouched. It's cool that the game wants to clearly delineate when you're in stealth, but I mean, this is Assassin's Creed. Don't limit the player's ability to put a hood on in the series known for hoods. It isn't launch Valhalla bad, and you can at least still fight with the hood up, but it's just a weird artistic decision that was in no way necessary. But even with those nitpicks, Syndicate has arguably the best traditional sneak and stab stealth in the franchise. But the Creed itself tells the player to hide in plain sight. How does Syndicate do in that regard? Well, personally, I think it does a really good job with what it has, and actually attempts to be creative with social stealth in ways that previous games had started getting lazy with. I've already talked about the smaller crowds, but in all honesty, I think social stealth is much more interesting in Syndicate than it was in Unity, despite all that. While Unity allowed for more options to utilize crowds in the open world, given how many people were always around, it was also fairly uncreative, content to give you seas of civilians to become invisible within and leave it at that. Syndicate has fewer social stealth options, most of which are curated for specific missions, but they actually give the player ways to manipulate these crowds, not just use them as mobile haystacks. Take this early mission where Evie has to infiltrate an area surrounded by a crowd, but the police are holding the people at bay. I wasn't sure how to approach this, so I started by luring one enemy into the crowd and killing them quietly there, and to my surprise, the NPCs then started to advance, pushing forward and giving me a clear path to my destination. I was in no way expecting this because crowds were almost entirely stagnant in Unity. Rarely did you have slowly moving groups of NPCs, and rarely were they dynamic enough to react to your actions and change your environment. And this happens a couple times throughout the game, such as later when you have an assassination mission where you can corral the crowd from one part of the train station to another, giving you a pathway into a restricted area. Another great addition is the kidnapping feature. This almost functions like a disguise, allowing you to take an enemy hostage and in doing so, become invisible to your enemies so long as you stay inconspicuous. However, you have to move slowly and avoid letting anyone into your circle of detection, keeping it from being as overpowered as a full-on disguise system could have been in this game. Being a blade in the crowd is really fun because the game is actually interested in making it a major mechanic instead of defaulting you to hiding behind boxes and slicing people. I still wish it was used more, but I loved what we did get, and it is a shame we haven't seen any real progression of these mechanics since. The last thing I want to talk about stealth-wise is the black box assassination missions. These were one of Unity's coolest additions, and they felt like a no-brainer in a series like this. Pop a player in a sandbox with a target somewhere inside and have them go at it. In my Unity review, I was positive of these missions, but I really think Syndicate takes things a step further. My absolute favorite thing about them is how unique and intricate every locale is. Unity's black box missions were kind of inconsistent. You had things like the Notre Dame, which were so grand, and then another assassination mission in a small cemetery. But Syndicate has no such problem, with black box locales ranging from a bustling factory to a creepy asylum to the Bank of England itself. And while Unity was somewhat lacking in its special opportunities, with only the very first one getting a unique cutscene for following a set path, every single black box in Syndicate has a cool, cinematic assassination opportunity. Black box missions and stealth in general, in my opinion, blow not only Unity out of the water, but pretty much all of the other games in this series. As far as the original vision of Assassin's Creed goes, I think Syndicate comes closest, perfectly realizing the first game's aim to mix Hitman-esque assassinations with a vast historical open world. We even get the trippy post-kill sequences where your perspective of the target shifts between them on the ground and them standing to face you as they die, a fun callback to AC1. A lot of aspects of Syndicate felt like they were stuck on damage control, changing things to make them functional. But stealth was a department that was solid enough in Unity that some polish and creativity were able to legitimately push the series forward in an exclusively positive direction. With stealth, Syndicate rose above Unity pretty handily, but now I have to talk about combat, which is in my opinion this game's least successful attempt at rehabilitating Unity's systems. While many components of Unity were tweaked or revamped for this game, combat is essentially just a full-on replacement. Now, I didn't like the combat in Unity. It was sluggish, inconsistent, and a visual mess. I like the idea of a slower paced and more difficult system, but there are plenty of games out there that handle that idea much better. Syndicate, by contrast, is once again more polished. It is crisp, and inputs happen when you want them to. While the animations in Unity would regularly fail to line up correctly, with Arno's sword ending up somewhere near his enemy's body, blades and fists make contact where they are supposed to in this game. But even though it is more technically sound, it doesn't always feel like that. Button presses still feel disconnected from what's happening on screen, but while the issue in Unity was mechanical, in Syndicate it is artistic. In this game, the combat is meant to have a fast-paced, brawler-type feel to it, like a gritty fight in the street instead of a gentlemanly duel, but in my opinion, it's just too fast, and the animations simply do too much. Pressing the attack button just a few times can lead to a barrage of blows to your enemy, as Jacob and Evie absolutely plaster whatever poor NPC is in front of them. Since there aren't a lot of combat inputs, a lot of your time is spent mashing the singular attack button. Anything outside of that is very contextual. You press parry when your enemy's health bar turns yellow, break defense when it turns gray, and otherwise you just keep mashing. There is not much depth here, and while depth has never been a keystone of AC's formula, it did at least used to look cooler. One of the few things that is retained from Unity, however, is the spongy guards you come across if you venture into high-level areas. The easy mechanics plus high health pools leave you pressing the same button over and over for like a minute straight for some enemies until they finally die. Enemy types also fail to add depth because variety is almost non-existent. You have the same regulars, brutes, and elites who follow you throughout the entire game, and you pretty much just mash your way through all of them. I know a lot of people were especially critical of the brute character models, which really stand out since you kill the same large bald man about 500 times over the course of the narrative. One thing I think is cool is the fact that the game utilizes weapons that can be concealed outside of combat. You only get 3 weapons, the cane sword, the kukri, and the brass knuckles, but all of them are hidden when your character is just strolling down the street. That has no impact on gameplay, but little details like that are really cool sometimes. However, while I don't mind only having the 3 weapon types, it is still worth noting that this game falls into the same trap as pretty much every other classic AC title, which is that there simply isn't a meaningful difference between them. No matter what weapon you use, you'll still just be mashing the attack button, and all that really changes is the animations. Range doesn't matter since it's a paired animation system, and damage is tied to weapon level, not weapon type, so you really just switch for visual reasons. As you level up and conquer boroughs in London, you unlock more weapons, which is a much better system than Unity's microtransaction-heavy method of giving you the ability to buy endgame weapons with real money from moment 1. I don't mean to be cynical, but it seems like Ubisoft was only really interested in giving us a wide variety of customization options when they had more aggressive ways to monetize them. Let's be clear, there is still a pretty gross microtransaction store, but this time it just feels like a carryover from Unity. You get everything you need by playing the game, whereas in Unity, a 100% playthrough could leave you with less than half of the total weapons and gear on display. However, there is also this weird crafting system that is just entirely negligible. I have no idea why it's there, and sometimes it can be annoying when you can't access a weapon because you're missing a crafting material or something like that. It isn't a big issue, but it just doesn't need to exist, kind of latching on to that trend of having a crafting system at all that was getting big at that time. Overall, unlike everything else here, as far as combat goes, there isn't much to compare to Unity. Both have completely different systems, and neither are particularly good in my opinion. Unity is more mechanically interesting, but it just doesn't work very well, and Syndicate is more responsive, but it's not very fun. And I will also say it does look silly, with really goofy animation sets throughout that do not look mocapped compared to the previous games. This silliness, however, is on brand for Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and that leads me to the final and possibly most maligned aspect of this game. So now we're talking about the story, and this is where a lot of people really dig into Syndicate. A lot of that criticism is focused not on the performances or even the structure of the story, but instead on the tone. The game has a decidedly lighthearted spirit from beginning to end, with a wide variety of superhero movie one-liners and a zany supporting cast. Standout lines have become memes that people use to represent their distaste for this type of storytelling.
Assassin Christmas.
I get the lack of appeal here. A lot of people think of Victorian London with dark, dreary skies choked by smoke and reeking of horse manure. Ubisoft Quebec instead decided to take a more Dickensian approach, showcasing the Victorian-era exploitation of the working class through a humorous lens. However, that's not to say at all that Syndicate's contemporary comedy is able to match the sharp satire of Charles Dickens. But that said, it really doesn't matter if there is precedent for it or not. You like it or you don't, and I'm not trying to change your mind there. I myself am pretty mixed on it. I like when games take themselves seriously, but I don't think the Assassin's Creed games have historically been able to back that up with actual effort in the storytelling department. Unity, for example, since I've made a lot of comparisons to that game, may take itself twice as seriously, but I believe it is twice as dumb, with far fewer fleshed out characters and nonsensical plot progression by comparison. But at the same time, there are so many characters that get played for laughs that could have been more than an opportunity to make a joke, especially real historical characters. Police Contact Freddie Aberline, Alexander Graham Bell, and even Charles Darwin are fine in the roles they play, but I didn't need every scene with them to have some kind of punchline. And the protagonists themselves fall victim to this too. I found them charming throughout, an opinion I know not everyone shares, but in moments where the tension does start to boil over between them, I couldn't help but feel like there was a lot of room for a few more serious scenes. Tone and characters aside, the story itself is fine. While Unity's plot necessitated a 30-minute rant in my video on that game, Syndicate is both less offensive and less memorable in my opinion. It gets into things fast, immediately establishing that London is essentially a Templar fortress, with no successful assassin activities within it for the past 100 years. Our twin protagonists, Jacob and Evie Fry, are low-level but talented assassins born into the Brotherhood who tire of the Council's inaction and decide to take the city back themselves. That is the gist. It is a simple game with a simple story. There weren't any hugely terrible storytelling decisions like in Unity, nor the big goosebump moments like AC2 or AC4. From here, each sequence is a very traditional outing where you have a few missions locating and exposing your target, and one cool black box where you kill them. Each person you kill represents a specific area of life that controls the people of London, be it the banks, Parliament, or the criminal underground, and each Templar has a clear personality, a welcome improvement over the cardboard cutout villains in Unity, but they're not all created equal. In line with the discussion on tone, several of the villains are essentially humorous metaphors for the roles they inhabit. Philip Twopenny's belligerent demand that a homeless man get a job pokes fun at the out-of-touch opinions of the wealthy toward the lower class, while the Earl of Cardigan's bumbling rants satirize political incompetence. It works, but when you put them next to targets like Pearl Attaway and Maxwell Roth, who are allowed to be characters on their own as well, I find myself wishing that level of depth was afforded to all of them. I will take a moment to throw some praise toward Templar Grand Master Crawford Sterrick, as performed by Chris Holden Reed. A lot of people criticize the character as a bland villain, but I thought he was more than serviceable and really well acted. He is a mustache-twirling evildoer, but as a stand-in for the hypocrisy of the British elite in contrast to the working class, I found him effective. Plus, the way in which he slowly spirals mentally as his empire crumbles away is more interesting than what a lot of other villains in this series get. I also appreciate that every target is allowed time to breathe. AC Syndicate only has 9 sequences, and the first 2 are only a single mission each, while Unity had 12 in total. However, Syndicate has a total of 37 missions to Unity's 32, and if you remove the Rift missions that don't actually progress the story, Unity only had 29. That game oftentimes had you learning about a target in one mission and killing them in the next, but in Syndicate you spend a few missions dismantling their operation before you take each one out. While Unity's main missions were fairly repetitive outside of the black boxes, in Syndicate each story mission gives you unique tasks like fixing fuses atop the Elizabeth Tower, or hijacking a carriage, or even exploring the old home of Edward Kenway. It is much more creative with its main missions, and the story overall benefits from this. However, the structure of this story isn't all sunshine and rainbows, and I think its biggest issue is how it handles its dual protagonist narrative. On paper, the idea of playing as 2 assassins with different playstyles sounds great. In practice, I think it hurts more than it helps. Jacob and Evie were advertised as opposites, the hot-headed brawler and his reserved, stealthy sister. In reality, they play pretty much the same. You get a couple extra skills unique to each, but neither combat, stealth, nor traversal are radically different no matter who you choose. But while having 2 protagonists is uninspired from a gameplay perspective, where it really hurts is the story. You have a shoot-first, ask-questions-later character like Jacob who wants to start a gang and conquer London, and across from him is the calm, composed Evie, who is a by-the-book assassin. So it would make sense that Jacob gets the more action-oriented, gang-related missions, and Evie gets the stealthy, assassination-based missions, right? Well, no. In fact, while Jacob does lead the charge on the gang warfare front, he also gets pretty much every assassination mission in the game. Evie only gets the one she kills in her intro mission and a rival character who clashes with her throughout the story. So if Jacob is conquering London and taking out all the targets, What exactly is Evie doing? Well, she's looking for a piece of Eden that doesn't really factor into the story until the end of the game, and unconvincingly falling in love with the only assassin in town who is not her brother. Of the 37 missions I mentioned, there are 23 where you must play as Jacob, 11 where you must play as Evie, and 3 where you can play as either. In the final 2 sequences of the game, which consist of 8 missions, there is only a single one dedicated to Evie alone. On the box art, she gets as much play as random gang member number 7, and she was totally absent from a lot of the marketing, including the cinematic trailer. If you take Jacob out of this game, there is no story here. You're left with a haphazard series of Evie's excursions throughout London. But if you take Evie out of this game, you still have a full Assassin's Creed tale with a solid roster of targets and a clear linear story. I've talked a bit about the reports made by Jason Schreier for Bloomberg regarding misconduct within Ubisoft, and in one he discussed that according to his sources, Evie Fry was one of the many female characters in the franchise who was set to have a larger role before the company actively forced them out of the spotlight. I talked about these allegations when making my video on Valhalla as well, and some people got upset that I was taking time out of a review of a game to go over outside issues. That is a pretty senseless take, because it 100% negatively impacts the game. Victoria Atkin imbues Evie with such a strong charm and wit, as does Paul Amos for Jacob, but the character feels tacked on to Jacob's story as some sort of obligation, and this narrative suffers for it. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in this section is that while I praised the setting so much earlier, I do think the narrative also suffers from how it handles the Victorian era in general. Something that sets this game apart from other AC games is that the Templars are not just a small sect of agents infiltrating positions of power. Instead, they control every industry in the city, and have for 100 years.
This tea was brought to me from India, by a ship, and up from the harbor to a factory, where it was packaged and ferried by carriage to my door, unpacked in the larder and brought upstairs to me. All by men and women who work for me.
Starrick makes it clear here that the Templars have full dominion over London at every imaginable level. In other games you are rooting out the bad apple, in Syndicate you are trying to clean out an orchard. Many of the problems around you are systemic and baked into the city's institutions. How can you fix that with a blade? The game itself poses this question.
What did you accomplish, boy? A bolt loosened in Starrick's machine. A large bolt. But not enough.
Your Grandmaster will fall.
You assassins can circle London to your heart's content. The mechanism we have built has been going strong for 100 years, and will run 1,000 more. It is the very city itself.
The problem is that the game is ambitious enough to question how systemic problems can possibly be solved by just taking bolts out of a machine, but it isn't smart enough to give an answer. Jacob and Evie proceed to rip a bunch of bolts out of London until the Queen knights them herself and they race off to the end credits. The game tries to have it both ways, tackle social issues, but solve those issues exclusively by murdering individual people. And it does bring down the apparent stakes of the narrative when it opens up by telling us that a box of tea can make it from India to the Grand Master without a single person off Templar payroll touching it, only to then realize that killing 9 people dissolves the century-old operation entirely, no different from the weaker Templar orders of the past. You have multiple people in the game who basically say killing me won't change anything, and then you kill them, and it changes everything. Again, this isn't necessarily that different from other AC games, all of which simplify their issues into things that can be solved with focused killings. But rooting out a spy in the Continental Army is one thing. This game asks you to confront class inequality with brass knuckles, and it isn't deft in its handling of that. I think a situation that exemplifies this well is how the game addresses child labor. This article in The Guardian by Dr. Alana Harris of King's College specifically calls attention to the missions in which you infiltrate factories to free child workers. Child labor is synonymous with Victorian-era London in modern pop culture, so it makes sense that this game would want to address it. In the game, these children are essentially kidnapped street urchins, forced to work in sweatshops. However, in real life, many child laborers would have been voluntarily going into the workplace as employees, and in many cases, families would rely upon the income they brought home. As grotesque as that may seem to a modern audience, it stands that to walk into a factory and stab their foreman in the neck would just mean they would go and find a new job. The people who actually helped child laborers were those who pushed for and passed legislation, largely by the time this game is set, putting protections in place for these children. And so in order for Assassin's Creed Syndicate to use child labor as an issue they could solve by stabbing people, they had to separate it from the reality of the situation and simplify it until it hardly resembled the original problem in the first place. I think that acts as a good microcosm of how Syndicate handles history. Class disparity and exploitation of the working class are used more as mascots of the Victorian era than topics the game actually wants to grapple with. Every AC game sterilizes history. Unity advertised the French Revolution heavily before launch, only to be desperately afraid to present any kind of commentary on it at all when the game came out. But it is the fact that Syndicate is actually willing to bring up these issues in the first place, combined with the joking tone through which it does so, that makes the handling of this historical setting stand out more. Now, regardless of all the historical inaccuracies and the sloppy handling of era-appropriate politics, how you feel about the narrative will boil down to tone. I know I've been hard on it here, but I really did enjoy my time with it. I like the world and characters enough to feel connected to it from beginning to end, but it tries to tackle themes it isn't smart enough to handle, and the exclusion of Evie from most of the story tanks the pacing. It is by no means the bottom of my list, but it isn't up at the top either, and I can see why some people just don't mesh with it. That was a lot of analysis just for me to wrap up by saying that this game is mid, but I do think it is a more complex product than people give it credit for. People tend to conflate silliness with stupidity, and while Syndicate is most certainly stupid sometimes, there is a depth to the mechanics and story that deserves to be acknowledged. I think when compared to Unity, this game is an incredible accomplishment. I know people wanted Unity, but better, but with the time and resources Quebec had, I am in no position to believe that was possible. So to still get a fun and complete game out of all that is awesome. I didn't talk about it here because I want to reserve the option to do a video on DLC later, but the Jack the Ripper follow-up is a really cool package too, that sheds the lighter tone of the main game and presents you with a darker, less inviting version of London. The story of that one fizzles out near the end, but the change of tone and the fact that this may be the only content I've ever played that starred a middle-aged woman makes it more than worth a look. Some people may question why they didn't just make that the tone in the first place, but that simply isn't the game they wanted to make. And regardless of how I feel about every aspect of this experience, the highest praise I can give Syndicate is that it is unabashedly the game it wants to be. It isn't held back by trying to be Unity Part 2. The devs brainstormed what they felt would make a fun game, and then they made it happen. I love that there is so much amazing content in this game. I love how visually diverse and unique the city is. I love how dense and creative the story missions are. I love how much it wants to immerse you in London. I don't love the boring combat, nor the weird morphing of Victorian-era London to fit their narrative, nor the fact that Ubisoft forced this game out the gate so fast after Unity in the first place. When I take all this together, I legitimately do believe Syndicate is a high-quality Assassin's Creed game, and just as importantly, it's a solid video game in general. You can go back to my review of Unity and walk down the list of complaints I had, and it's amazing that Syndicate was able to address so many of them in so little time. But ultimately, it probably didn't matter to Ubisoft how Syndicate came out. Origins was already in the pipeline, and change was coming no matter what after Unity tanked the company's reputation. But while its impact was low and its mechanics very mixed, I hold Syndicate in pretty high regard. It's a game that actually wants to be fun, and I think it succeeds. That is all I have for today. Let me know what you think of AC Syndicate in the comments. I will honestly try to respond if you are respectful. This is my last video of the year, most likely, and that wraps what is my first full year on YouTube. I could not have guessed that I would have had so many cool people watch my stuff and chat with me on this platform. I am a small creator, but if I were to just stop getting views right now, it still would be 1,000 times more than I ever thought I'd get. But it's not going to end, and I look forward to another year of making videos for fun, and hopefully getting to spend more time with all of you. But for right now, do have a great day, take care of yourself, and have a very happy
Assassin Christmas.
I always forget to talk about the modern day in these games. It exists. That's what I can say about it. Still better than Unity, honestly.